Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Lighthouse Technologies. The topic of today's webinar is Defeating Defects, Overcoming the Three Perils of Software Development. I am Lindsay Wilanzik. I'm the Technical Account Manager here at Lighthouse. A few housekeeping items before we start today. I want to go over just a few things, so bear with me. We're recording today's webinar, and everyone is on mute. So if you are having a quick lunch, don't worry, we cannot hear you munching. Questions will be fielded at the end of the presentation. However, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat with the presenter box on the left side of your screen. And like I said, we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Okay. Here's a little bit about our presenters. Julie Hagan is the Senior Practice Manager here at Lighthouse. Julie carries over 20 years of software industry experience and excels in tailoring processes to a metrics-driven, risk-based methodology. I definitely practiced that a few times today. And Jeff Van Fleet, who we have some familiar faces on here, I'm sure some of you have met. He is the President and CEO here at Lighthouse. He has over 30 years of software and QA experience, and he is an expert in the QA processes and systems. Jeff is old.
Yeah, but thanks.
I'd like to point that out, that Julie is much younger than Jeff.
Much. Keyword being much.
So before I hand it off to Julie, I'll go over what we're going to discuss today. So we'll be talking about how projects get blown off course, how software defects directly impact the software development life cycle, and how to prevent software defects, which is extremely important in today's world, and how to keep your software projects from overrunning their budget, which obviously money rules all. So I will hand it off to Julie now, and enjoy, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Before we get into the meat of our talk here, I have to give you a disclaimer. It appears the bubonic plague has entered the Lighthouse doors. So if you were planning to stop by and visit us, you might want to wait until next week after we've bleached everything. But Jeff and I, we may be coughing a little bit. We're going to try not to, but should that occur, just bear with us. And
she was looking at me when she said that, so you're just glad you're virtual today.
We'll be right back on track in no time, should that happen. So with that said, let's get started. So when we have this defects conversation, I like to start by asking a couple of questions here. Are defects driving up your project cost? That's kind of a loaded question, actually, because sometimes we don't know that it's defects that are driving up our project cost, and we'll talk about that some today. And are you constantly overrunning your budget? So give those two questions a little bit of consideration as we walk through our material here. And if you can right now answer yes to those, the good news is that you're not alone. They're very common problems, and that's why we're here today. So at Lighthouse, we've spoken with, it sounds like an exaggeration, but I'm sure we have spoken with hundreds of executives about the challenges that they face. And as a result, we began over time to notice a pattern. So project managers, as we all know, we're trained to focus on cost and schedule. So cost and schedule represents the delays in dollars portion of this graphic here. What we began to realize over time is that quality, so the amount of defects that are, no kidding, injected into that solution, is a major contributor to those two things, to cost and schedule, or therefore delays in dollars. So we began to coin this term, the three perils of software development: defects, delays, and dollars. Today, we're going to focus really on the defects themselves, the impact they drive, most importantly, what can we do about it?
And frankly, not just defects. A lot of people think about defects just as coding defects, but we're really going to talk about it more holistically is defects in all of the work products in your software development lifecycle.
Yes, exactly. Holistic discussion. So I know that some of you on the line have seen this before. So don't be entering the answers into the chat box or anything.
Oh, hey, let me interrupt. Hey, it's really kind of cool. It's fun watching everybody kind of pop in here. But we've got folks from California to New York City. I'm not sure we have anybody international today. It's tough to tell right now, but it's kind of fun just seeing everybody gathering across the country to learn and kind of grow together here. So thanks everybody for joining.
It is. Our colleague here, our software testing practice manager, Brian Keck, he's not with us today, but we just attended Star East down in Orlando a couple of weeks ago, and there was such a large international presence there, and it was really fun to see all of us from literally all over the globe talking about the exact same challenges.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So similar to what we're doing here today. So for those of you who have not seen this little exercise before, this is kind of a fun thing to start with. So take a few seconds there at your desk or your car or wherever you are right now, and think about what these three numbers might mean in the context of software testing.
They're in the drive-thru at Wendy's.
Yeah, could be. I promise I won't sing while we wait, because that's not good for anybody. Okay, so 5 is a multiplier. Defects are 5 times more expensive to find and fix for each phase of the software development lifecycle that they go undetected. So it doesn't matter if you're still in a waterfall environment, some organizations are, or if you're somewhere in your Agile transition, or if you're a mature Agile organization, the impact remains as defects remove from one work product to the next. 10,000 is the number of defects that we found once in a client's production system. So think about that, production system, because that's not terrifying to have 10,000 defects in your production system. It was a big system, but still, 3 million is $3 million. So the point there is that as few as 100 defects, it's really not that many, in a large system especially, can cost as much as $3 million to find and fix if that defect was introduced way back during the creation of the user story and made it through the whole way to production.
You can imagine what 10,000 defects can cost?
Right, exactly.
Holy heck.
So with all that said, let's talk defects. Okay, so one of the things we get asked all the time is, where do defects come from? And, we hear people ask each other this, and often the answer is, well, our requirements are terrible, or this or that, lots of reasons. But really, defects come from us. They come from people. We inject defects really in everything we do. That's just the nature of being human. Therefore, we inject them all throughout the software development lifecycle as well. So from the user trying to define what they want, to the BA writing a user story or a functional spec, the developer doing the code, the tester creating the test cases, we're injecting defects all that time, and it's not just that we're injecting them, it's that we're not finding them early enough. So as defects leak, we call that leakage here, from one work product to the next, they cause rework. That rework, as you all know, I'm sure, is never in the plan. So by definition, then, it's unplanned. And unplanned rework costs money. It costs a lot of money. So some of our clients will try to protect themselves from that in multiple ways. One of the ways some of them do that is by using commercial... Weapons. Oh. Nice. Weapons. Okay, we're off the rails here. By using commercial off-the-shelf products. But those are built by people also, so they will have defects as well. They might have fewer defects, but they'll still have defects. So either way, buy or build, this is a situation that we need to address.
Yeah, I mean, the COTS products are interesting because we do think of them as stable, right?
Yeah.
But obviously the COTS products are built by developers, and some of those organizations are better than others at the quality of the product, right? And if the product's been out in the field for a long time, it's obviously a lot more stable than new releases coming out, new patches coming out. So you just got to be careful about that as well.
Right, and we're definitely not trying to say don't use COTS products.
Oh my gosh.
We're just trying to say be aware of the risk.
Especially when you ask, especially when you ask that vendor to customize the solution for you, because now you've got customizations, right? So it's just like building fresh code.
So I want to show a graphic here, back to that concept of defects becoming more expensive the longer that it takes to find them. So as you saw in that little exercise we just did, at Lighthouse we use a 5x multiplier to quantify the impact of that unplanned rework that the defects drive. But there's some data published, like this data here, it's from HP, that uses an even larger multiplier. And in this case, the multiplier gets bigger the further you progress through the software development lifecycle. So just be aware, we think we're conservative with the 5X actually, and the impact could be even larger.
Yeah, no question. So that whole concept of defects being injected and not found, and then accidentally slipping to the next work product or the next phase, and causing that unplanned rework has this, no kidding, exponential impact. So you used that, what do you use, 100 defects earlier for $3 million?
Yeah.
So $30,000 for a requirements defect, interesting problem, and I think HP's data kind of proves that out.
Yeah,
so.
For sure. Okay, so this graphic represents CMMI level maturity, so the capability maturity model of the development team and the end result of how many defects are being delivered to user acceptance testing or even to production. So what happens is the maturity level of the team has a direct impact on the number of defects being introduced, and consequently then the impact of those defects due to that rework that we've been talking about. So as you can see here, a level 1 maturity level development team will introduce far more and remove fewer than a higher level team. So you can see the dramatic slope of the curve there, just going from a level 1 to a level 3.
So see, just for everybody that might not be familiar, a level 1 is really an ad hoc organization. Processes might exist, but they're not consistent across the organization at all. Level 2 is the processes are consistent within a project, if you will, and level 3 is the processes are consistent completely across the organization. So everybody's trained the same, you can move people across the organization. So level 1, ad hoc, level 3, organizational consistency of process. Whether it's waterfall or agile, it's irrelevant.
Right, exactly. So on that, sticking on that concept of process, maturity increases by applying a consistent process and methodology. And it's interesting, one of the things that we're seeing with the industry's move to Agile is we're seeing some companies allowing their Agile teams to all individually define how they're going to work.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to give that autonomy, that Agile is a proponent of.
Right.
And the autonomy is great, but what we're seeing happen is different teams have established a different definition of done or a different definition of ready, or even the length of their sprints. So over time, that approach, it's driving an inconsistent result across the organization and therefore limiting their ability to follow this curve, the slope of the curve down, reducing the number of defects being delivered.
Yeah, so you imagine if you've got 100 different Agile teams working, and every team has their own sort of way of doing Agile, there's just no consistency. There's no way to measure improvement or drive improvement because everybody's individual here.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is we're trying to help organizations move from being so, artsy about it to being more sciencey about it. And just drive some consistency, and then everybody will grow and learn and train and be able to be more mobile across your organization.
In the same way, which will cause them to be more predictable as well.
Right. And what we're seeing is even what people call a defect is different between these different Agile teams.
Within the same IT organization,
right.
The same development shop.
Right. So it just causes more chaos, and it shifts you, even though it's goodness that you're doing things quicker and faster, you're shifting back on the CMM chart more to the left there, and you're getting more defects as a result.
Right. And therefore more cost. So we've talked about the magnitude of the impact that defects bring to your projects due to, again, all that unplanned rework. So then the next logical question is, how can we reduce that impact? Well, so we then need to reduce the number of defects introduced in the first place and also find a way to remove the ones that are introduced as early as possible. So these are some ways to accomplish that. So use well-trained staff. Well, many of you know that at Lighthouse we always say people first. So that's the best place, we believe, to start. So to do that, you might need to assess their current level of performance so that you can just decide how much, if any, training is needed
Right.
to raise the bar and therefore introduce fewer defects.
Right.
You can implement work product inspections if you aren't already doing that. So when we say work product inspection, we mean a formal assessment, if you will. Here at Lighthouse, we use the IEEE standards. You can Google those. It's real easy to find,
Yes, it is.
quite frankly. But we use those standards to identify defects in those work products so that they can be removed before they propagate to the next phase of the process. So with user stories, for example, you can implement that right in the backlog grooming process.
Right.
And just make that part of that whole exercise.
We see a lot of organizations just need training on how to build user stories better, and how to ensure that they've got consistent, clear, well-communicated requirements, if you will, that then get handed off to the sprint teams or the development organization.
Right, exactly. And most organizations are doing backlog grooming, and they're expecting that to find all the defects, and it is finding some,
Yep.
but not at the level that can be found and removed by using a more formal mechanism, such as IEEE, for example.
Right, and I know we're really talking about testing here, and what we're trying to do is shift the conversation for all of our clients to more of a quality assurance conversation and trying to help your whole software organization improve. So as testers, we're not going to be the ones, we might be the ones inspecting requirements or user stories because
yeah.
we use them to build the test cases, right?
Yeah.
But we're not going to be inspecting the architecture and inspecting the design. We're not going to be doing that, but the development organization ought to be doing that, and the testing or QA organization is just ensuring that that happens so that you can remove those defects before you build a poor architecture or you end up with a bunch of rework from the architecture or design.
Consider code analysis. Employing some code analysis, there are tools out there.
Yeah, like CAST. I mean, CAST is a fantastic tool out there that you can look it up. It just gives so much insight into the code that can help everybody improve the way they do development.
Right, exactly. And from a testing perspective, specifically what it does is it allows you to have visibility into where the solution is the most complex or fragile, so you can employ then a risk-based approach and focus your testing efforts deeper into those areas of the solution, thereby removing more defects.
Right. And if you're advanced in your Agile to where you're moving toward continuous integration, continuous deployment, a CI/CD model, having a code analysis tool that integrates into your deployment, if you will, into your CERT or QA environment, automatically just checking the quality of code can really help, especially if it can identify defects and create issues or whatever in JIRA for you. So tools like that exist. CAST has been, just kind of one of our favorites.
And then have some rigor and some visibility into your test coverage. You can do that by using requirements traceability, user story traceability. Implement negative testing. We know here at Lighthouse that a negative test will find up to 60% more defects than just the happy path or positive testing. It's unfortunately the first thing to get cut when the timeline gets tight, though.
Yeah, because everybody has to do the requirements first. Did it do what we planned to do versus did it not do what we didn't expect it to do? Yeah,
that's a great way, though, to leave defects behind, causing that unplanned rework and more cost, which is what we've been talking about. Don't forget about your smoke testing. It's best if it's scenario-based.
And most facilities are now smoke-free, so you have to do it outside.
And then keep a good handle on your regression testing. In an agile world, regression testing quickly becomes a bottleneck if your testing's manual.
Holy heck, yeah.
We are seeing a lot more organizations moving to a test automation strategy for that reason, for that regression, and also to enable, things like continuous integration, continuous deployment. But if you're not there yet with a test automation strategy, don't just let regression tests fall off the list of priorities.
Right.
Because again, there'll be bad fixes.
Yeah.
We'll introduce functionality that breaks other things and you won't know. until it's a lot more expensive to find it and remove it.
And we're big proponents, for those of you that are agile, which probably most of you are,
Yeah.
we're big proponents of hardening sprints. So that's a test-only sprint that you might plan it every 5th or 6th or 7th sprint is a test-only sprint that allows you to sort of catch back up, because what ends up happening in each sprint, you just can't get all the regression done. And frankly, even if you go full automation, oftentimes you can't get it done either because you continue to build additional automated test cases. There are just techniques that allow you to ensure the integrity of the work product, if you will, and hardening sprints is one of those techniques.
Right, yep, agreed. And then it's always surprising to us how many organizations either aren't establishing or aren't adhering to any kind of exit criteria. So it's important to know exit criteria, it won't necessarily help you eliminate defects during the software development lifecycle, but it will help eliminate production level defects.
Right.
And that's where they become the most expensive to identify and remove.
Yep, that's right.
So you would think that it would feel like it's worth the investment to adhere to exit criteria, but I know we all live in the real world and there are deadlines to meet and time to market to consider.
Yeah,
right?
but even if you establish the exit criteria and you report on it, then management in the business can make a decision. Do we release anyhow, even though we have a few SEB 1s, or maybe we have no SEB 1s, but we've got a couple of SEB 2s, but we've got some strong workarounds. So it's a tool to inform your organization on the risk that's about to move to production, which depending on that risk level is going to impact your help desk. So,
right, exactly. So at least you're being intentional about the decision you're making versus just flying blind.
Right, exactly.
So most companies that we work with anyway are at around an 80% defect removal efficiency. 95% should really be the goal.
Explain to them what that is first.
Yep, I will. So for those of you who aren't familiar, defect removal efficiency is basically a calculation of the number of defects found and removed prior to release over the total number of defects. So you're assessing what percentage of defects you're removing prior to going to production or to the next phase of testing if you're a waterfall organization.
Yeah, and usually people measure the production level defects in this calculation for 90 days.
Yep.
So you know, the numerator is how many defects did I find before I released, and the denominator is before I released plus the first 90 days.
So if you think you're at something less than 95% and you're not employing some of the things that we just talked about, then introducing those is a good way to improve your DRE.
And for those of you that are out there running business systems, we think the 95% number is a very good number to. If you go to try to do above 95%, it gets expensive. If you do below 95%, it also gets expensive. It just gets expensive because you end up with a bunch of production defects.
Right.
If you're building some MRI machine or you're building some missile command center, you might want something greater than 95%. So
yeah, you just might.
Yeah.
So think about the industry you're in and
That's
what you're doing. Okay, so we've been talking a lot. So another exercise. Break up the monotony a little bit. I don't think as many of you on the line today have seen this one, but some of you might have. So you know the drill now. Spend a few seconds thinking about what these numbers might mean in the context of software delivery.
939, 2 and 2.2 million. I don't even know what they mean.
That doesn't surprise me, actually, because it's a new one. Okay, so 939 is the number of unique defects that we found on a client's new website that they were building. This was an e-commerce client, and they were releasing a new version of their website. And one of the key pieces of functionality in there was meant to improve their conversions. So if you're in retail, you understand how important that is to your revenue. So the 939 defects were 5 times more than expected. So the rest of this is a little bit of a good news, bad news story. So we've talked about unplanned rework that these defects drive. That unplanned rework causes delays. So in this case, 5 times more than the number of defects planned for caused a delay of a couple of years. So this particular retail client missed their holiday release, as important as that is in retail, 2 years in a row.
Yeah.
That's the bad news piece of the story. But the good news piece of the story is that all those defects that they didn't know were there were found earlier
Right.
than they would have been had they all just slipped to production if the release had gone on as scheduled. So that actually saved them $2.2 million in rework.
Right. Right.
So the delay is a bad thing, but the saved rework is a very good thing to the tune of $2.2 million.
Right. Exactly right. Not to mention customer satisfaction.
Absolutely. So there's opportunity costs, right? So they missed their holiday release. So therefore, that conversion functionality wasn't deployed when it was originally scheduled to. So that revenue was missed. So to the tune of $155 million in overall opportunity costs.
Right. So what happened here is, you know, the new technology, when it was finally released, did what it was expected to do. Their customer conversion rate went up a few fractions of points, and as a result of going up those few fractions of points, it had this kind of impact of $155 million. So the good news is when the technology was finally released with the right quality, it actually worked well. Bad news is it took them a long time to get there, but frankly, through diligent testing efforts, we helped them, and frankly, they helped themselves get there sooner than they would have otherwise.
So we've established through these case studies, really, and the rest of our conversation, that these defects have a real cost impact and cause projects to overrun their budget. So much so that, in fact, the average cost overrun for a global IT change initiative is 27%. But 1 in every 6 will overrun their costs by an average of 200%, according to Harvard Business Review. So this is why so many projects get canceled after spending millions, sometimes billions of dollars. It's that 200% cost overrun, because at some point organizations just have to stop the bleeding.
Right, and they're not sure that they'll get done.
Right.
Or you spent so much money, you eliminated the ROI.
Right, completely.
Yeah.
So hopefully none of you have ever seen that happen.
Really?
In your careers. Okay, so 200%, we've talked about this a lot. How can we avoid this and stay on budget? Well, it's a lot of the things that we talked about already, right? It's critical to avoid that unplanned rework that the defects cause.
It's important that it's important that phrase, even if it's not exactly that phrase, that concept of unplanned rework begin to stick in your head, because people like your CFO will begin to understand that if we don't get it right, then there's going to be a trickle-down impact to that. And if you can begin to quantify what that looks like, it allows you to invest in better training, better processes, and better tools to stay on track.
Right. It's really powerful to be able to quantify the impact of that rework.
Yes.
Powerful, because now you have a business case. You have an ROI to get the things that you've needed in your organizations for who knows how long to improve that maturity level.
Right.
So we've talked about testing early and often while the impact of those defects is still manageable. But also consider a test automation strategy if you haven't yet. So many of our clients are already doing that as an enabler, really, of continuous integration and continuous deployment, because that's become so important in our agile world in improving time to market. But it can also help you broaden your test coverage, which naturally helps you to find defects earlier and reduce the impact of those defects.
Automate test data, right?
Exactly.
You can test a bunch of different kinds of transactions and test it instead of just testing 1 or 2. I don't know that we mentioned this, but one of the interesting things that we noticed as the organizations have been gone to Agile over the last few years, a lot of us didn't forecast the impact on manual testing.
Right, yes.
So we went to Agile to get small chunks of code done faster, right? Which is a great thing, and it gets it out the door and into the user's hands faster. But what we didn't understand is at that pace, it's difficult to stay caught up with manual testing, as we were talking about earlier, and we didn't forecast now we really have to automate to stay on this cadence, to keep this velocity up of getting these sprints out the door. So it really begins to be now, and that's something that everybody talked about at Star East, was it's now not a desire as much as it's a must-have, that you have to move to an automation strategy. Otherwise, you're going to bottleneck your whole Agile process.
Right. So test automation, the decision used to be all about the ROI behind it.
Yeah.
And while ROI is important, we're actually seeing less of that now as a driver, and more, I can't cripple my Agile team.
Right.
Because then I'm going to screw up my time to market.
Right.
So it's been interesting to watch this evolve.
It has,
over the last several years up to where we are now. We talked about a consistent testing methodology and how that's lacking somewhat in some of the companies that we work with. We talked about the fact that that helps you become more mature and therefore more predictable, but it also helps you become more efficient as well.
Absolutely.
Which is a cost reducer in itself.
Right, and I think it's important to understand your particular organization. So if you do your testing with your own team and it's all employees, it's easy to apply that consistent methodology.
Yes.
If you're a heavy staff aug, now it's really important that you define that methodology and that you train new people coming into the organization on what that looks like. Or if you use a partner, that you've come into some agreement on what a consistent methodology will be between your team and your partner's teams. So yeah, the methodology, it's like that CMM chart that you showed earlier.
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly what it is. Yeah. And then minimize hidden costs. We're going to talk about what those hidden costs might be here in a minute. But how else? What else can we do to stay on budget? So let's talk about independence in testing for a minute. So why is independence important? And therefore, why might someone even want to consider using an independent testing partner versus an internal organization? What we have seen is that a third party doesn't have the pressure to not find defects. And I know that sounds weird.
It does, yeah.
So let me explain. So sometimes internal testing teams, unfortunately, actually have pressure from the organization to not find defects for multiple reasons. Sometimes managers want to know which developers are introducing the most. So those developers feel at risk. And then there's tension between test and development, and it drives this overall culture that's unhealthy. And then nobody wants to find defects because nobody wants to talk about the fact that there's defects, because somebody might get criticized for that or even fired for that.
Yeah, in fact, several years ago, we were hired to do an assessment for an organization, and the hiring director, that was his objective. He wanted us to identify the weakest developers they had so that he could fire them. We were not so much into that, and frankly, over several weeks, convinced him that the better approach is, how about we assess the capabilities and let them build trust in us as an independent partner, so that we're not going to disclose it was Charlie Brown or Sally Smith who injected the most defects or is the weakest. It's just that the organization needs training, and if we give them that training, now the overall efficiency of the organization is going to improve, and it builds that trust. It really is a way that independence is important.
It is.
And frankly, whether you use us or not,
it's not about that.
Right. It's really about why you would do it.
Right.
So
the value of independence. And hopefully that's not happening in your organizations, but we know that it does happen.
2 weeks ago, we got asked the question again.
Yeah,
I'd like to know exactly which of my developers are generating the most defects. And again, it just sort of causes the hair on the back of our necks. I don't have any hair on the top of my head, as you guys probably know, but to stand up. So it's just not one of those things, because we're interested in how do we improve the overall software effectiveness of the organization. How do we manufacture software and get it out the door better, faster, cheaper? And pointing fingers at individuals just isn't a healthy approach to that.
Right, it's not. And then also independent testing partners, they employ professional testers, which just means they're often more efficient and effective than internal teams, purely because they have the right training and the right skill set and the right tools and the right support to be able to bring that higher level maturity and efficiency to the organization. And then many of our clients are utilizing an offshore testing partner relationship, and that carries hidden costs as well, due to things like security risk, collaboration challenges, additional project management overhead. Sometimes it takes more people offshore to do the same work onshore, and those are all costs that aren't necessarily apparent from a visibility perspective. So when you factor in those additional costs around an offshore relationship, we found that $35 an hour is really equivalent to more like $48 to $58 an hour.
Well, CIO magazine found that out.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And CIO magazine also says that utilizing an onshore strategy can mitigate that by up to 65%.
So interesting thoughts
Yeah.
out there. I know it's easy for a lot of the hiring managers to look at just the straight out cost per hour, but it turns out it's more complex than that, and a lot of our customers realize that, but frankly have a hard time building a business case to fight it.
This was a big topic at Star East as well,
Yeah.
by the way, which was interesting. We got to participate in a leadership summit that allowed the attendees there to identify pain points and work on ways to solve them, and this was a big topic.
Right, that's a good point.
Okay, so let's recap. So today we discussed how projects get blown off course in the first place, how those defects directly impact the software development lifecycle and the associated cost with project delivery, some ways to prevent those software defects in a proactive, intentional way, and what are some things we can do to keep those projects from overrunning their budget when so many overrun 1 in 6 by 200%.
And don't forget, as we're wrapping up here, I know several of you have chatted questions into us. If you've got questions, use that chat box and shoot questions over to us.
Yeah, because we'll be getting to those here shortly. So hopefully what we've talked about thus far has been useful and you've got some takeaways. Some things that I'd like to make sure that I think are most important that you take away today is that first and foremost, those project failures are avoidable. It can be easy to feel overwhelmed in our industry, and sometimes it feels like swimming upstream. But know that they are avoidable, and there are techniques out there that we can employ to make this better.
Right.
Right? To get started now, what can you do? Well, people first, right? So if you don't have professional testers and developers either inside or outside of your organization, think about what it would take to change that.
Right.
I'm not saying get rid of all your people, right? You can turn your people into professional testers with the right training and certifications.
Right.
So think about doing that. It's an investment that will be worthwhile.
And we were on a panel in Atlanta, I don't know, a couple of months ago now, talking about the IT talent and the lack of IT talent inside the Atlanta region. And I think their unemployment rate in IT is -2%.
-2.
Which
Atlanta,
means
yeah.
the only way that anybody's getting any people is they're stealing them from each other, and then it's this ripple effect across the entire organization. And so the message was we have to train our people and we have to build cultures to retain them. So educate, train your people, invest in your people, because it's really expensive to keep losing people and go and find other people.
And then secondly, to get started right now, inspect work products if you're not already. That is not a real difficult thing to implement in your organization. Any of you can feel free to just pick up the phone and give me a call.
Right.
I'm glad to spend 30 minutes talking about it with you, and you'd be able to get started, at least in some small way, inspecting work products and finding those defects as early as possible.
Particularly in user stories.
Yeah, that's
right.
the best place to find them,
Yep.
where you get the biggest bang for your buck.
Right.
Supplement testing with automation, if you're not now, for all those reasons we discussed around CI/CD, enabling Agile,
Right.
broadening test coverage. If your organization has a partnering strategy, an outsourcing strategy, consider onshore partners, because it might not be as much more expensive or any more expensive as your leadership might think it is.
Right.
When you factor in the offshore hidden costs that we discussed. And then try to take an honest look at your current state. That's hard to do because we tend to not be objective within our own organizations. That's human nature. But try to do it, or call up a partner to help you do it. If you can do that, then you can identify low-hanging fruit to have some quick wins and gain some improvement and reduce the number of defects you're delivering.
Good point.
So be intentional. I guess that's my message, is be intentional about reducing
Or
defects.
intentionable.
Or intentionable.
Yeah.
You know, trying not to cough causes some strange things to come out of one's mouth. But be intentional about reducing them, because in turn it'll reduce the cost associated with all that unplanned rework that we've been talking
As
about.
you might imagine, if you have a baseline of how your team is performing today, and then you can begin to take some of these proactive steps, that you can see, you'll be able to see the curve change, and you'll be able to prove your ROI to your leadership team and secure more funding to try to make your team more efficient.
So those were the key takeaways. I'd like to give Jeff a few minutes here, which I almost never do, to talk a little bit about why we do what we do here at Lighthouse, because it aligns really well with what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, and we've talked with a lot of customers about their organizations and some of the challenges in organizations over the last 17 years. And this data, I think we talked about some of this data before, is that there's $360 billion being spent annually on software. So a giant number, but what's more interesting is about 25% of that is being thrown away on failed and canceled projects. So the why we do things at Lighthouse and why a lot of you as leaders do things are trying to make your organization not throw that 25% away, make you that more productive, get more value in your business, and help grow your businesses. And you can see here, if the project was planned at $1 year and $1 million, the data that we talked about earlier shows that it really is taken more like 2.2 years and $2 million to complete the same project.
To actually complete less work, though, because what tends to happen is that we're taking longer, we're spending more, and we're delivering less functionality because we start to panic, right? So we're trying to make the date and stop the bleeding.
Right.
So now we're figuring out what functionality can be cut. So I think that's an important point, that we're only delivering 60-ish%
Absolutely.
of what we intended to deliver, even though we took twice as long and spent twice as much.
And here at Lighthouse, as we've developed our processes and techniques for our customers, we call it a principle-based approach. And it's because we think about software differently, right? It's hard, right? These systems, getting these systems out the door, it's hard. Whether you're a pharmaceutical organization, whether you're a retail organization, whether you're a manufacturing or technology organization, there is a lot of pressure on all of us to get these systems out the door, and frankly, with less money than before.
Right.
And it's really easy for projects to get off track, so you've got to put some metrics and measures around your organization and your performance so that you know how you're performing and the changes you're making so you can see that that's actually helping and improving. Something else that I think is becoming more and more apparent to us is when organizations are led by leaders who want transparency, who want to know the truth, they can be effective at change. And so you as leaders of your testing organizations, your development organizations, you can, even if your corporation might not feel wanting so transparent, you can isolate your people and give them a sense of transparency and trust so that you can begin to grow and improve your productivity. So that transparent culture and that trust is really important. And I blog on topics like this every month, and it's just, to grow, you've got to trust your people, and their people have got to be able to trust you.
Yep.
And that's what creates motivation and people feeling empowered. So it's the right kind of people. Julie talked a lot about being people first. You've got to be able to retain your people. You've got to be able to give them a culture and fun, exciting work to work in, but they've got to be able to feel like coming to work for you is trusted, okay? And I feel like that I can be taken care of, and that if I find a problem, it's okay to raise my hand and say, hey, I found some problems. I got some ideas on how we may be able to improve that. That's what we're trying to help our organizations and our customers do, and I'm sure you all are trying to do that in your organization. So let's go. And then just last chart here really is, at Lighthouse, the things we do here, Obviously, we do software testing, both manual and automated for our clients. We do test strategy and help test planning, and really these assessments that Julie talked briefly about. If you're trying to figure out where you are and where you want to be, we can help you in that space if that's something you're interested in. We've got an EBS, an Oracle EBS practice where we help clients more at the enterprise level as they're rolling out commercial systems. And then, obviously, like everybody else, we do a little bit of staff augmentation. So that's really all I wanted to add is, think about your organizations from a principle-based approach and just build your culture the way you want to build it.
All right, so looks like we do have a few questions.
Back to you, Lindsay.
It is back to me. I thought he would hand it off, but he didn't. So
back to you, Lindsay.
Take the initiative and feel
That's
empowered.
okay. She's okay jumping in. Trust me.
So the first question we have here is fairly upfront. How do we get started?
It's funny when we get asked this question because I waffle and I shouldn't. The reason I waffle is because I've really got two answers.
Yeah.
The people first side of me says get started with getting an objective assessment of where your people are from a training perspective and determine the gap so that you can close it. People always represent 65% of an organization's overall improvement. So that's what I tend to lean toward in terms of how to get started. But it's just also so easy and so impactful to start inspecting if you're not doing that, that I want to say that too.
That's a good point. Yeah. It is really easy. And Frank, starting user story inspections, you can Google it and Wikipedia will jump straight up and really give you 90% of what you need right there.
Right. And remember, backlog grooming is not it. It's not enough.
Right.
So don't kind of fall into the trap of, well, we're backlog we're grooming our user stories, so we're good. It needs to be a little bit more disciplined and rigorous than that to find the maximum amount of defects that you can find and drive them out.
Okay.
Is that it?
We have more questions.
Dang it.
The next question is, can you suggest any specific automation test tools?
Okay. So that's a really loaded question because it depends on a lot of different things. So before I jump into an attempt at an answer, let me throw out there that we have a test automation webinar that we do where we dive into tools. So I'm not sure when we're doing that next one, but if you're interested in that, keep an eye out for it.
Yeah.
But for now, let me just say that it depends on your automation goal. And it depends on what you're automating, what kind of shop you are. Are you .NET? Are you Java? Does your organization like to use commercial tools, or are they open to open source tools? What kind of skill set do you have? Open source tools require a little bit more technical skill set than some of the commercial tools. So that's really hard to answer for those reasons.
And if you got a bunch of manual testers and you're trying to convert them into test automation, there are some commercial products that make that a lot easier than some of the open source products.
Yes.
So really, there's a lot of questions that go in, a lot of details, I guess, go into that question.
A lot of detail,
sorry.
Again, glad to talk with you, though, about it on the phone so we can talk a little more specifically about your current circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Sorry, Jeff. You say that defects can be caused by poor requirements. How can I tell if my requirements are poor or not?
Good question. So people inject defects, and one of the ways we do so is by injecting them into requirements and or user stories. IEEE, I know I mentioned them earlier, does a really good job of defining the goodness that should be in a requirement. So I would start there and check that out. It's things like ambiguity and consistency, clarity, making sure requirements aren't contradicting each other, making sure they're complete.
Right.
So some objective criteria by which you can compare your requirement or user story to that criteria and make a decision about whether or not you think there are defects there.
Yeah, something else that I would maybe add to that a little bit is the way you can tell if your requirements are in good shape or not is when you're finding defects in your testing activity, if you begin to track where that defect got injected, that will tell you how well the processes are working through your development process. Was it a requirements defect that you discovered in coding, in your testing process, or was it more of an architecture or a design defect, or was it, frankly, a coding defect? So if you look at it that way, you can tell, geez, I've got a whole lot of defects over here that came out of my user story process. If I could tweak that and fix it, I'd have a whole lot less unplanned rework to deal with.
Okay. Next question. What is the best way to do RCA on the found defects?
I don't know the RCA phrase.
Yeah, I don't either.
Oh, thank you. Oh, root cause analysis, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was funny. So when you're discovering defects, a second ago I was talking about categorizing them. So what we like to do is kind of categorize them two ways. One is we like to categorize in what work product were they injected,
right,
even regardless of where you found them.
Right.
And we like to categorize then what portion of the system or which modules of the system were they in.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that piece?
Yeah,
before
exactly.
I start coughing?
So it actually aligns well with another question that came in. So like Jeff said, we like to look at where the defect was injected, because if we know that the bulk of the defects are being injected in user stories, then we know that we might have some BA training that we need to implement there to improve that. Or if we know that they're being injected, no kidding, in the coding phase, then we might have some developer training that we need to do there as well.
And if you're running CAST or a
Yep.
code analysis tool, they'll drill in specifically to the line of code that has a quality issue or a memory leak issue. It'll point right to that, and it will give you the best practice specifically on how to fix that and how to train your people.
Yep, it will absolutely tell you. So where the code isn't factored appropriately, if you will, now you know,
Right.
and that's likely a root cause if a lot of defects are being identified in that part of the solution.
Right. Right. And then as you then track a defect against a specific area, against your I don't know, give me an part of your e-commerce platform, checkout or something like
Right.
that, you can begin to identify which parts of the system are the most fragile.
Yes, exactly.
And there's some really nice metrics that you can pull out of JIRA or whatever your defect
Yep.
tracking tool is. Once you begin to put that data in, it points to the fragile areas, which allows your development team to then go refactor those areas and build stability back in. Again, code analysis tools can do things like McCabe complexity analysis
Yes.
that can identify weaknesses in your code and help educate your development organization on best practices to minimize those kind of weaknesses.
What's really nice to do if you're employing code analysis is also track, one of the things we like to always track, code analysis or not, is we like to break the solution apart into logical components and then track the defects by those components to see if that data aligns with what the code analysis is saying the most fragile part of the system is.
Good. Yeah, this particular person said, yeah, thanks, I do component heat maps in JIRA. So that's
Good.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're big fans of that.
Absolutely. So, and Pareto analysis, those kind of techniques can give you more insight into more of those kind of details depending on the size and complexity and the numbers of defects you're finding.
Okay. One last question. You talked about defects in dollars. What kind of metrics do you suggest we track to give us insight?
Tracking where the defect is injected is a really important piece of data to quantify the impact. Because when you know that the defect was injected in the user story and it slipped all the way to, you know, I don't know, one of the test phases or to production, then you can use that 5x multiplier to quantify the impact of that unplanned rework that took place.
Yeah, if for that person, if you want to talk about that further, we've got a tool we built internally here that can help you build that business case and show what that cost of that unplanned rework really was. I know everybody gets that concept, but what happens is the leadership team that are funding these projects generally don't get that concept. And when you begin to articulate, geez, these 100 defects from requirements or user stories leaked and therefore caused a bunch of unplanned rework. My designers designed and we coded this part of the system that was wrong because we got that requirement wrong. It begins to put some light, if you will, on the funding, right, that you'll need to help improve those processes.
Okay. All right, so it looks like we have answered all of the questions, and we are rapidly approaching time here. Before I go, I do want to say we are going to be holding what I consider the next half of this webinar on delays on June 29th. So we hope to see you guys there. It's really interesting, and it's just kind of more in-depth on what I consider the second half. So yeah, on behalf on everyone here at Lighthouse, we want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar on defeating defects.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And for now, our team is standing by to answer your questions. You can reach, our main number here is 937-458-0055. Julie is at extension 328, and Jess is at extension 201. The information is there up on the screen, and we'll leave it there for a little bit so you guys can write it down or give us a call. And we look forward to hearing from you and hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.